Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what will probably be our last Zoom session for this class for this semester. I'm pretty confident we'll be able to get through all the information we need to get through tonight, so we can just afford next week's what we would normally have as a Zoom session next Tuesday, just afford that time to you to go ahead and complete working on your final assessment. So where we are currently at in the course, most folks have already posted their Canvas essay number 5 responses and responses to classmates. If you have not done that yet, please do make sure to do that by this evening, by midnight tonight. Then the only thing that is left for you to accomplish is then that final assessment that we took a look at last week. The final assessment then is due by midnight next Tuesday. And then once you've completed that final assessment and turn that in by midnight next Tuesday, that will then wrap up all the assignments for the course. And then I will work on evaluating those next week on Wednesday. Hopefully have all the final grades calculated then for you and submit it to the university no later than next Thursday, the 13th, as long as the university remembers to open the grading roster. Sometimes they forget about these hybrid courses that end at the midpoint of the semester. And so sometimes it takes them a few days to kind of catch up to opening the grade roster, but that usually is rectified pretty easily with just a simple email. So I will hopefully have all your final grades all ready by March the 13th. So what that then leaves for us tonight is we have two primary topics left to cover in this class: the management of human resources, which we'll do in the first half of class tonight, and then the management of fiscal resources, which we'll do in the second half of class. And we kind of set this information up last week at the end of class when we talked about career civil service and the evolution of the career civil service system and where civil service came from. So in the first half of class tonight, we're going to talk about how we manage those individuals, those administrators who are part of that career civil service system. And then the second half of class, how we manage the public financial resources that we are charged with managing as public administrators. So the first half of class will give you insight into PPA 577, Human Resource Management. And then the second half of class will give you some insight into PPA 555, Public Budgeting and Finance. So that's what we are planning to do tonight. We cover both of those topics tonight. Then by the end of our time tonight, you'll then have all the information that you need to address all those scenarios and those questions on the final assessment. So this will wrap up all the information we typically cover in a semester in this course. We just do it in a little bit more of an accelerated version here in the 8-week hybrid approach, as opposed to the full 15-week semester. So without further ado, let's pick up where we left off last week, where we presented the career civil service. Now let's talk about how we manage those individual administrators who are part of that career civil service, what we refer to as human resource management. Some of you may already be working in the field of human resource management, so some of these topics may be very familiar to you. Some of you may have never worked in human resources before, so some of these topics may be new. But the whole purpose here is to just underscore how we manage human resources and then to provide you with a little foreshadowing of some of the material that you'll get into in a lot more in-depth fashion once you get to PPA 577. So when we are managing human resources in the career civil service, there are essentially 4 different phases to the human resource management process: procurement, allocation, training and development, and discipline and sanctioning. So we're going to go through those 4 different phases and talk about the different functions that we engage in each one of those phases as we are managing our personnel. So we'll start with the procurement phase, and we are familiar with procurement. We've talked about that multiple times so far in this class. This is essentially that staffing function that Graham Allison says is one of those generic management functions that is shared by both the public as well as the private sector. Now, as we know, Graham Allison says it's not so much that the public and private sector both engage in staffing. The difference really is in how they engage in staffing. So as we go through procurement, we'll talk about how that procurement process differs between public, nonprofit, and then private organizations. In procurement, what we need to do is first start out with recruitment. So we need to recruit people who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the jobs in an efficient and effective manner. We have to, after we do our recruitment, put together our applicant pool, then we also have to have some type of empirical selection process, whether it be an examination or whether it be a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. We have to have some type of mechanism that we can employ to then select from that applicant pool those applicants who we feel are best suited for the positions within our organization. So that's procurement. Then once you have those individuals in your organization, the second phase of the human resource management process is allocation. Allocation is essentially dividing up the work, separating the work out among all the different positions within your organization, essentially deciding who does what. Within this allocation phase, we will do things such as conduct a job analysis, conduct a job evaluation, and we'll talk about how you do that and the similarities and differences between an analysis and an evaluation, and then use that information to then construct a position classification system where we can array all of our different positions in this classification system, and then we can assign compensation to each one of those positions. By doing that in a position classification system, what we are then able to do is we are able to ensure equitable compensation. So people will get equitable pay for equitable work. We'll also, as we talk about evaluation, make a distinction between what we consider to be job evaluation versus performance evaluation. And we'll talk about how we evaluate the performance of employees in the human resource management process, different types of formats that we could use to try and evaluate employees, and then some best practices, if you will, in terms of how we can ensure that people are willing and able to accept the results of their performance evaluation process. If that performance evaluation process demonstrates that there is subpar performance, that employees are not being as efficient or as effective as they should be, then that recommends to us the need for training and development, which then pushes us to the third phase, which is training and development. And we'll talk about the importance of a return on investment whenever you invest in training programs. We'll talk about in-house versus out-of-house programs, their advantages and disadvantages. But if we find that employees are not performing up to their expected performance levels, then we need to make sure that they have the skills and the abilities to perform up to that expected performance level. If after providing the training and development opportunities, the individual employee is still not performing up to those expected levels, then we move to the fourth phase of human resource management, which is discipline and sanctioning. So tonight we're going to go through those four different phases and talk about some of the specific types of things we do as we match human resources through those four different phases. So let's start with the procurement phase. And in procurement, we always have to start with recruitment. So if we want to staff up our organization, we have to go out there and we have to try and recruit so we can get the most qualified applicant pool we can possibly construct. Now, this is a major difference between public and private sectors. If you're working at the local or the state level in a government agency, it may have taken you several months to get hired into that position because we really do our due diligence when we go out there and recruit employees in the public sector, because we're not just all about efficiency and effectiveness. Those are two very important values for us, but we are also very concerned about equity. We're very concerned about creating a representative bureaucracy. So oftentimes in the public sector, we are going to be more likely to do targeted recruiting as opposed to what you might see in the private sector. So targeted recruiting, we will target our recruitment efforts to engage in outreach to members of underrepresented populations. And so I'll give you an example of how it works here at Long Beach. We have not had the opportunity to hire a tenure track faculty member since about 2019, 2020. So it's been about 5 years for us. Hopefully we'll get lucky this spring and we'll be authorized to hire a tenure track faculty member. But whenever we need to go out there and recruit for a tenure track faculty member, it is a multi-step process that typically will take us about 8 to 9 months from the inception of the process and from the advertising of the position until we are able to provide that final job offer to the top candidate. So it's a very protracted type of process. And again, it's protracted for the purpose of making sure that we are getting qualified people and to also make sure that we are assuring equity and that we are creating a representative workforce. So the way in which it'll work here at Long Beach is whenever we do get approved to hire a tenure track faculty member, it's then the job of whomever is doing the hiring. I did the last one. It was my job to then put together a position announcement, which will detail all the requirements of the position. And in that position announcement, we'll also have inclusive language to encourage candidates from underrepresented populations to apply, again, for the purpose of diversifying our faculty. That position announcement, before we can advertise it, needs to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity to make sure that it has the inclusive language that it needs to have. So we do that position advertisement. We then get it approved by Office of Equity and Diversity. Then we have to put together a recruitment plan. And that recruitment plan is a very lengthy plan in which we detail how we're going to go about the recruitment, where we are going to advertise this position, what types of outlets, and how those outlets that we are choosing to advertise in will contribute to the diversity of the job applicant pool that we are creating. So if we want to create the most diversified faculty that we can possibly create, and again, it's important in public administration that our diversity of our faculty will represent the diversity of the student body. And so we go out there and do this targeted type of recruitment. We will not just advertise in the traditional places like the Chronicle of Higher Education or in places such as publicsectorcareers.org, which is kind of the primary public administration job database that is out there. We will certainly advertise in those. Sometimes we'll advertise in higheredjobs.com as well. And those are kind of your traditional general types of recruitment sources. But in addition to that, we'll also do some targeted recruitment. So we want to encourage applications from women. And so what we'll do is we will reach out to the section, the Society for Women in Public Administration, which is a section of the American Society for Public Administration. And we will advertise with that section. We will advertise with the National Federation of Black Public Administrators, the National Association of Black Political Scientists. There is a section within NASPA as well as one in ASPA for Latinos in public administration. So we advertise in those outlets as well. I also will then put together recruitment letters to send out to the directors of doctoral programs around the country that have a strong track record of granting doctorates to members of underrepresented populations. So those are just some of the strategies that we use in order to do this type of targeted recruitment. All those details of how we are going to recruit, where we're going to advertise, all those have to be included in that recruitment plan. That recruitment plan then again has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Once we get that approval, we can then start advertising the position. We usually try and advertise the position beginning in early to mid-July, and then we will have that position open for applications, usually until sometime in maybe mid to late September. Once the application window closes in mid to late September, we then have our applicant pool. That applicant pool then needs to be submitted to the Office of Equity and Diversity for the office to approve that, yes, indeed, there is enough diversity within this applicant pool. If for some reason your applicant pool is not approved as being diverse enough, you would then be sent out to then reopen the recruitment and re-advertise again. We've been fortunate the last 2 times that we have hired that our pool has been initially approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Once that pool is approved, you can then move on to the interviewing process. So you would then have to construct your interview schedule. That interview schedule, the questions that you are going to ask your potential applicants, those questions must be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity to make sure that they are all in legal compliance with California and federal state law, California state and federal law. They also need to be approved to make sure that they do not have implicit bias or cultural bias built into those questions. Once you get your interview schedule approved, then you can select your pool of semifinalists. The way we usually do it is we usually select anywhere from about 6 to 10 semifinalists, and we will conduct Zoom interviews with those 6 to 10 semifinalists. We will apply that interview schedule to those interviews. That semifinalist pool needs to be, again, approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity for adequate diversity within that semifinalist pool. Then from that semifinalist pool, we will then select 3 people to bring them to campus for on-campus interviews. The selection of those 3 finalists, again, needs to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity and by the College Dean's Office. Those 3 people come to campus, we conduct our interviews, and then we make recommendations to the dean in terms of which of those candidates are qualified to be hired for the position. From the beginning of the process of actually sending out that advertisement in July until we are actually offering someone the position, the advertisement goes out in July. The offer for the position usually is going to happen sometime in late February or very early March. So you're talking about a very gradual, very protracted hiring process. That is much different than what we tend to see in the private sector with at-will employees, in that at-will employees can be interviewed and hired, brought onto the payroll all in the same day. We just simply cannot do that for obvious reasons in the public sector. So recruitment is our first step that we're going to go through in the procurement process, in bringing people into our organization. At the federal level, the Office of Personnel Management still has a function in terms of recruitment. It's still not the same. It's not the same function that they had after the passage of that Civil Service Reform Act that we talked about last week. Civil Service Reform Act really did place the Office of Personnel Management kind of at the top of the recruitment process. And they were the ones who would put together the eligibility list, tell agencies who they could and could not interview. Now it's been decentralized much more down to the agency and the departmental level. So after we put together our applicant pool and we do our interviews, then the question is, which applicant are we going to select? So the second step here in procurement is selection. We need to have some objective empirical standards that we can apply for the purpose of selecting employees. Now, at the federal level, traditionally, the approach was the use of examinations. And at the federal level, the examination that was traditionally used was what was called the PACE, the PACE examination. And the PACE examination was a standardized exam that OPM would create. OPM would then administer that exam. And then what they would do is the people who then scored the highest on that exam would then receive placement on what's called an eligibility list. Sometimes it was referred to as a rule of 3. Sometimes it was called a rule of 5. If there were 3 people, the 3 highest scorers that were placed on the eligibility list, that's called a rule of 3. 5 highest scorers, that would be called a rule of 5. So once they put together that eligibility list, then the agencies could only interview people off of that eligibility list based upon their performance on the PACE examination. In addition to how you perform on the PACE exam, there's also something that's referred to as veterans preference. And so whatever score you get, if you are a veteran of military service, you would then add on additional 5 points to your score, again, to give preference to veterans. Now, examinations, we realized did not work that well. And that's why we kind of backed off these examinations and moved more toward a more holistic review of an applicant's knowledge, skills, and abilities. There are a couple major problems with the examinations that used to be used at the federal level. One problem is that they had a lot of cultural and implicit bias. The way in which the questions were written were biased against certain members of underrepresented populations. So that was obviously a problem. The second problem is that the examinations oftentimes were not considered to be very valid. If you're going to use an examination for your selection, that examination must be valid. That examination must reflect the job that it's testing for. One of the most common types of validity for examinations is what's known as content validity. Content validity means that the content of the exam must match the content of the job. There's a very famous case in the late 1970s called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. And in the Griggs case, the court found that what the company was doing is they were using examinations for a custodial position that asked questions about things like higher order mathematics, skills that you did not need in order to be successful and productive in this custodial position. So that exam lacked content validity. So the exam must match the content of the job. A second type of validity is what's known as criterion validity. And you'll talk a lot more about these types of validity and validation strategies once you get to PPA 696 research methods, because it has applicability for research methods as well. But criterion validity looks at essentially how well does performance on the exam correlate with performance on the job. If they correlate strongly with each other, performance on the exam correlates strongly to performance on the job, then that exam is said to have criterion validity. There are a couple different ways in which you can test for criterion validity. One way to test for it is what's called a predictive validation strategy. Predictive validation would mean that you would give the examination to job applicants. You would score that examination. You would then take your top scorers on the exam and you would hire them into probationary positions. You would take your bottom level scores, your lowest scores, and you would hire them into probationary positions. Then you would evaluate the performance of those two samples of applicants. If it has criterion validity, then the exam is a good predictor, a valid predictor of performance on the job. Those who perform well on the exam should then perform well in their performance evaluations. Those who perform poorly on the exam will then be expected to perform poorly while on the job. It's how well does the exam predict future performance on the part of employees. The inverse of that is a type of validation called concurrent validation. And in concurrent validation, you just reverse the process. So in concurrent validation, you look at your current employees and you evaluate their performance. Those employees you select those employees who are performing very well, a sample of employees who are performing poorly, and then you administer the examination to them. Obviously, it's the reverse logic. Those who perform well on the job should also then perform well on the exam. So we need to make sure that these exams not only do not have cultural bias, but the exams also exhibit validity, both content as well as criterion validity. And many of these exams used at the federal level to hire federal employees simply lacked a lot of those types of validity. So because of that, we have seen the hiring process move away from standardized examinations and move more toward a holistic review of someone's knowledge, skills, and abilities. Now, not every position has given up on exams. And so if you are applying for a very specific position that requires a specific skill set that a lot of people do not possess, so you'll say you're a computer scientist, you're applying for a computer scientist position, and that position requires you to be able to use all these different types of coding mechanisms and to use all these different programs for coding, and you have to show proficiency in that. That type of job may still have that type of entrance exam. But for more general jobs in the general schedule at the federal level, we typically do not use the examinations. We move more toward a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Looking at someone's resume, their experience level, and where they've worked and what positions they've held, their education levels, looking at their references and how strong their references are, and kind of take this much more holistic view. When we hire people into faculty positions here in the Graduate Center, we use a more holistic view of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Granted, we will bring people to campus and we will require people to do teaching demonstrations for not just faculty, but also for students. We'll also require them to do research presentations to the faculty to make sure they have the types of teaching and research skills that are necessary for success in the position. But it's a much more holistic review of the individual as opposed to just how they perform on a standardized exam. An alternative to exams and holistic review of KSAs, or in addition to it, is an approach that's known as an assessment center. In an assessment center, what an agency will do is it will set up a simulated work environment. So on a Saturday morning, it'll create a simulated work environment, and then it'll bring its top job candidates into that simulated work environment and allow them to do the types of tasks that they'll be normally doing on a daily basis in that assessment center. You can then observe and record how well they're doing these tasks to give you some basic information about how well they will probably perform once they are on the job. Now, we know that there is a problem with predictive validation with these assessment centers because of what Elton Mayo taught us with the Hawthorne effect. Elton Mayo taught us that whenever we watch people, whenever we observe people, they tend to behave differently than when they are not being watched. So you would anticipate these people, while they're in this assessment center, will be very productive, will work very hard, and really put forth that effort, and the type of effort they may not put forth once they are hired into the position. So there is kind of a validity type of concern with some of these assessment centers. And the use of assessment centers also is very cost prohibitive. It's very expensive and it's very time consuming. So the focus in selection primarily now at most levels of government, a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Once you have then gone through procurement and you've gone through recruitment and then you have selected the employee to join the organization, another phase of the human resource management process is what's known as allocation. In allocation, we need to divide up the work among the people in our organizations and then evaluate those work tasks. So allocation and evaluation is your second phase in the process. The way in which we do allocation and evaluation, how we divide up the work, we will first engage in what's called a job analysis. And this is really a core function that needs to be done first in the human resource management process before you can do job evaluation, before you can do performance evaluation, before you can create position descriptions. So this is kind of the bedrock of the entire process. In a job analysis, what we will do is we will look at each individual position in isolation, and we will deconstruct each one of those individual positions into their component elements. Sounds a lot like Frederick Taylor in scientific management. It is a lot like Frederick Taylor in scientific management. So we'll look at each individual position. We'll deconstruct it into what tasks are done on a daily basis, and then what percentage of time will be spent by the incumbent on each one of those tasks. So we can really understand what those people in those jobs are doing specifically on a daily basis and where they are spending their time. We'll do that type of analysis for each one of the positions within our organization. One strategy we oftentimes use for that is a survey. So we'll provide the incumbent with a survey. That person will then fill out the survey saying, these are the tasks that I do on a daily basis, and here's the percentage of time that I spend on each one of those tasks. Then we'll supplement that survey with a shadowing process, where somebody from the HR office, a position analyst, will then go out there and will sit next to this person or stand next to this person as they are doing their daily job to confirm that, yes, these are the tasks that they're engaging in and the amount of time they're spending on each one of those tasks. Sometimes they will shadow a person for a full day. Sometimes they'll shadow a person for a full week. If it's a very complex job and a job in which the types of tasks that are being done will vary depending from day to day. But that's a job analysis, an analysis of the tasks of each individual job. Once we have conducted that job analysis, we can then take that information and use it in what's called a job evaluation. So whereas a job analysis is an analysis of each individual job in isolation, job evaluation is where we compare these different jobs together for the purpose of placing them on our position classification schedule and then assigning compensation. So an example in, say, a police department would be comparing the position of police chief and patrol officer. So for the police chief, some of the things that police chief will do, that police chief will be responsible for a lot of supervisory types of things. They will be running the police department. They'll be supervising all of the officers and all the civilian employees who work within that police department. So there are a lot of supervisory responsibilities. Those supervisory responsibilities will certainly require supervisory skills that you may not need to require from a patrol officer. That police chief may also have responsibility for the budget, and they will have to construct the budget on an annual basis. That's something, again, the patrol officer will not be required to do. They will probably have a requirement for interfacing with the public. And they're the ones who are going to go out there and talk to the media. They're the ones who are going to talk to city council, talk to the mayor, the city manager. So there's a lot of that interfacing with elected officials and interfacing with the public on kind of a grand scale. Patrol officers probably won't be interacting a lot with elected officials or policymakers. They may be interacting with the public as they're out there doing their patrols, but it's oftentimes a one-on-one type of interaction. So that interaction is a little bit different and requires different types of skills than the interaction that were required of a police chief, and so on and so on. The work conditions. So how dangerous are the work conditions? Well, obviously the risk of physical harm for the police chief will probably be lower than the risk of physical harm for the patrol officer. So in that respect, the patrol officer position would score higher than the police chief position. The most basic and by far the most common approach to job evaluation is what's known as a point factor job evaluation. And in a point factor job evaluation, what we will do is we'll, again, use the results of that job analysis, and then we'll look at all the different tasks that must be done on a daily basis, and we will assign a weighting mechanism to all those different tasks. So for the police chief, leadership and supervisory responsibilities, leading the police department, how important is that to that position? That may be 40% of the position. It's probably higher than that, but we'll say that's 40% of the position. So the weighting mechanism is a 0.4. In terms of managing the budget, that might be worth 20% of the position, so that is weighted at a 0.2. Work conditions might be a 10% of the position, so that's a 0.1. So we assign those different weighting factors, and then we multiply the weighting factors by a numerical score from 1 to 10. 10 being that that is a very important task in this job, 1 being that it's not a very important task in the job. We multiply the scale of 1 through 10 for each one of these tasks. We multiply that then times the weighting factor. We then sum up all of those results, and that final score, that summative score for the police chief position, can then be compared to the summative score for the patrol officer position. And if the police chief position has a higher summative score, then that police chief position will be placed at a higher level in our position classification system. So when you look at the federal bureaucracy and this classification system we talked about last week, known as the general schedule, if a position is classified at the GS-13 level, ostensibly that position has scored higher on the point factor evaluation than a position that's classified at the GS-11 level. The GS-13, since it scored higher on the point factor evaluation, will then get a much higher compensation level than that GS-11 position that scored lower on that point factor evaluation. So that is a process known as job evaluation. You do the point factor job evaluation for the purpose of classifying your positions. We classify positions so we can assign compensation, so we know the compensation is then equitable. It just stands to reason that if someone is in a position that requires more difficult tasks, has more responsibility, requires more of a skill set, then that position should be compensated higher than another position that doesn't have those same types of requirements. So use the job analysis to do the job evaluation, usually a point factor evaluation, to then place these positions within our position classification system. And then we assign compensation through what we call pay bands. Sometimes they're called pay grades. And we'll assign compensation to positions in each one of those classifications. We will also take the information that we have gleaned from the job analysis, and we'll use it to create the job description, sometimes called a position description. Now, chances are, if you're working in a governmental agency, you probably have a position description for your job. A traditional position description will just take the information from the job analysis and say, here are the tasks that you're responsible for doing on a daily basis. Here's the percentage of time you'll spend on each one of those tasks. That is a very traditional, very simple position description. However, the problem with a traditional position description is it just tells us what people are doing and how much time they're spending on those tasks. It doesn't tell us what performance level is expected. It doesn't tell us how well we expect people to do those tasks. So what a lot of agencies have done is they have taken these traditional job descriptions and they have transformed them into what are called results-oriented descriptions, or RODs. So in a results-oriented description, we will add in addition to the tasks, the amount of time on those tasks, we'll then add in performance expectations for each one of those tasks. So to take a very simple example, let's say we have a position that is a front desk receptionist. So that person at the front desk has some tasks that they engage in on a daily basis. They will probably be answering phone calls, and maybe that will take up 40% of their time. They may be greeting visitors. That may take up 20% of their time. They may be writing correspondence. That may take up 40% of their time. And so we get all that information from the job analysis. But what we want to know in the results-oriented description is what level of performance is expected for each one of those tasks. So in terms of answering the phone, perhaps a performance expectation level would be that every phone call is answered no later than the second ring using the script that is provided. Good afternoon, this is the blah, blah, blah. That type of script is used every time the phone is answered, and every phone call is answered within 2 rings. That is a performance expectation that then gets embodied within that job description. Maybe in terms of writing correspondence, you'll have performance expectations in terms of the words per minute that the incumbent needs to be able to type. Maybe there'll be some performance expectations in terms of the number of errors per page. Hopefully there won't be any, but the number of errors that are tolerated per page, those are performance expectations. So that's the example of a results-oriented position description. The nice thing about an ROD is that an ROD will really kind of serve as a nice segue to performance evaluation. So the next thing we're going to do in the allocation evaluation phase is we are going to engage in a performance evaluation to evaluate the performance of that individual on the job. Now, performance evaluation obviously is different than a job evaluation. A job evaluation will look at the components of the jobs and then compare those jobs to each other. Performance evaluation looks at the performance of the incumbent in that job. How well are they carrying out their tasks on a daily basis? Now, performance evaluation is difficult. And it's difficult because we have resistance on the part of both employees as well as employers to engage in performance evaluation. Employees oftentimes don't like to have their performance evaluated because it opens them up to scrutiny. And it creates the possibility of what we refer to as cognitive dissonance. Now, if you're familiar with the term cognitive dissonance occurs whenever you encounter information that is contrary to what you believe. So most employees believe that they are performing very well, that they're at least meeting, if not exceeding, performance expectations. Then they get their performance evaluation, and the performance evaluation tells them something completely different. They get some negative feedback from their performance evaluation. It creates this cognitive dissonance that will serve kind of to be a disincentive to them working harder. They'll get frustrated, and they will not trust the performance evaluation process in the future. Employers, supervisors, oftentimes want to avoid performance evaluations as well because the stakes associated with those evaluations are so incredibly high. So if you have someone who gets a poor performance evaluation, that may close the door for them to participate in a leadership development program. It may close the door for them for other types of rewards that they place a very high value upon. So employers kind of hate the idea of, for lack of a better term, playing God, and employees hate the idea of getting negative feedback that will be cognitive dissonance in compared to how they feel they are performing. So one of the most effective ways to get past this reluctance on the part of both parties is through inclusion, allowing employees to participate in the development of the performance evaluation process. The more they can participate in the development of the process, the more likely they are to buy into the results of that process. Now, this is something that we learned last week from Pressman and Waldowski and from Martha Durthick in terms of policy implementation. The more you involve implementers, the more likely they are to support the proper implementation of a policy. Same type of thing here. The more you involve them in the development of the performance evaluation process, the more likely they are then to have buy-in and trust that process. Performance evaluations can serve two main purposes. One purpose is a summative purpose, and the other purpose is a formative purpose. So a summative performance evaluation will provide us with, here is a summary score to tell you how well you are performing your job tasks. A formative performance evaluation will provide you with usable feedback that you can then put into your efforts on a daily basis to then help you become more productive. We hope that whatever performance evaluation approach we use will have both a summative as well as a formative element. Some of the formats that we use for performance evaluation are good for a summative approach, but not so good for a formative approach. The first performance evaluation format you see there is graphic rating. This is one we're all very familiar with. If you get performance evaluations in your job, you probably get a graphic rating performance evaluation. So it'd be those excellent, good, fair, poor types of categories. Well, the feedback you are getting is that, well, my performance is routinely good, excellent in a couple of areas, but good in the other areas. Okay, that's some positive feedback, but I don't really get any indication of how I can improve my performance to move from a rating of good to a rating of excellent. There is not that formative element. To have that formative element, you would have to combine a graphic rating with an essay approach, so that you've got the graphic rating, the excellent, good, fair, poor, and then you also have a narrative section where formative feedback can be provided. Another approach is a forced choice approach. This is where you give choices to the supervisor and they have to then choose between those choices. So you could have a statement such as, the employee is, and then one choice would be always on time for work. Another choice could be typically late 1 day per week. Another choice could be typically late 2 or more days per week. And then you choose one of those categories when you're doing the evaluation. The problem here is because it is forced choice. If you don't have the right choice categories listed there, you're going to end up with a lot of measurement error and measurement bias. A ranking approach is where you can, through whatever summative approach you are using, then add an ordinal ranking to each one of your employees' performance. And so this person is the number one performer, this is number two, and so on and so on. Ranking is very useful for assigning performance bonuses, for assigning pay for performance. The problem, obviously, is ordinal in nature. And we know from our study of statistics that ordinal data is just ranked data, which means we know that the person who is ranked number one is ranked higher than number two, but we don't know how much higher. It could be a very small increment. They can be very close to each other in performance levels, or there could be a massive difference the size of the Grand Canyon between the first person's performance and the second person's performance. So again, it's summative, but doesn't provide us with a lot of the feedback we usually need. The last one that's listed there on the screen, the BARS approach, stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. A behaviorally anchored rating scale. And a behaviorally anchored rating scale is very similar to what you would see in a syllabus that uses a grading rubric. So in a grading rubric, it will say, this behavior will lead to a grade of A. This behavior will lead to a grade of B. This behavior will lead to a grade of C. So if you get a B, you know you got the B because you exhibited B behavior. If you want to get an A in the future, then you know exactly what behavior you would have to exhibit in order to earn that grade of A. You're really anchoring your rating system in those actual actionable behaviors. That is important because that then provides that formative feedback. So you combine both the summative as well as the formative approach in a behaviorally anchored rating scale. The disadvantage, obviously, is a bars approach is going to take you a lot more time. It's going to be more resource intensive, more cost intensive to create one of those types of approaches to measuring performance evaluation. There is no best approach to doing performance evaluation. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish in that evaluation, whether it's a summative focus or a formative focus or a combination of the two, how much trust there is between supervisors and employees in the performance evaluation process. The context of the situation will lead you to determine which of these formats of evaluation you would choose to utilize. There's a very famous article several years ago by an author by the name of Charles Fox. And Fox wrote an article in which he referred to performance evaluations as what he called the keystone of the human resource management process. And so what he says is you picture an arch that's made up of all these different stones. That stone at the very top, at the apex of the arch, that's the stone that's referred to as the keystone. If you pull the keystone out, the entire arch will collapse upon itself. He's making the argument that performance evaluations as a keystone, if you don't do a good job of performance evaluation, your entire human resource management process will collapse upon itself. So we evaluate people's performance to see how well they are performing, and then we use the results of that evaluation process in order to move into the third phase of human resource management, which is training and development. So if through the performance evaluation process, we recognize that an employee is not meeting their expectations in terms of their performance level, we would then offer them training and development opportunities. Training should be provided in order to enhance skills and to contribute to the professional development of an employee, to their development as a human resource. Should it necessarily be used as a reward? If it's used as a reward, we're not really accomplishing what we want to accomplish with our training programs. We can choose in terms of our training programs to do training in-house. We can also do out-of-house training. In-house training, we could charge our staff members who are already working for the organization to conduct the training. That could be cost effective, but there are still opportunity costs. And so if you're using your current employees to do the training, to lead the training sessions, if they're leading the training sessions, it means that they are not having the time to do other types of things in their job description. So there are always those costs associated even when you have your employees themselves doing in-house training. You can bring consultants in for your in-house training as well, but that sometimes is costly in terms of those contracts. You can use out-of-house training where you can take your employees and send them somewhere else, so a leadership academy or some type of a leadership retreat where they can go and develop their skills. Again, that can be very costly. Since it is so costly, we see some organizations that really don't put the time and energy and resources that they need to into training and development. The training and development approach that you select needs to rate high with ROI, your return on investment. If you're putting all this money on the influx side, on the input side of creating these training programs, then those training programs really need to pay for themselves in terms of higher levels of productivity. An example that we had in our college a few years ago is that our former dean signed a contract with an external consultant to do the 5 behaviors training. It's a very famous training that a lot of corporations use. She wanted to bring that training to our college. Spent, I think it was about $250,000 on the contract, and we did the training. The training went on for about 6 to 8 months, and then it just ended. And it's never been touched again over the past 2.5 years. So that's an example of not really getting your return on investment. So you want to make sure whatever training you're using, you get that return on investment. Training and development is important because through that performance evaluation process, if you identify subpar performance, for a career civil servant, you cannot just fire them because they had one bad performance evaluation, or at least you're not supposed to be able to fire them if they have one bad performance evaluation. Career civil service protections will require documenting a pattern of subpar performance and then a pattern of management providing the training and skills to try and remedy that subpar performance. So there's a subpar performance, then you will have training and development opportunities provided to the employee. The employee, if they choose not to take advantage of them, that's on the employee, but you at least provide those training and development opportunities. If the employee attends that training, then you reevaluate them maybe 3 months later. If the performance is still subpar, then you would provide more training and development opportunities. Then you would reevaluate their performance a few months down the road, and so on and so on. You cannot discipline an employee or remove an employee from office unless you have a written, documented pattern of subpar performance and then training interventions to try and remedy that subpar performance. So it's much different dealing with career civil servants as opposed to dealing with at-will employees. But if you, through written documentation, you have created this paper trail of a pattern of deficient performance followed by training and development and so on, then once you have that written documentation can then provide you with the basis that you can use to discipline the employee or even to terminate that employee. There's kind of a misunderstanding that career civil servants cannot be terminated. That's not true. Career civil servants can be terminated, but they must be terminated for cause. It must be a performance-related type of termination. Again, I'll put the big asterisk next to that in our current situation at the federal level, we see terminations that are trying to be done irrespective of a performance evaluation. We've seen that with probationary employees. We've also seen that with some employees who are beyond their probationary stage. We had a really interesting situation. I think I mentioned to you last week that the Trump administration removed the head of the Office of Special Counsel from their position, also had removed a commissioner who is in a term that lasts until 2028, removed that commissioner from the Merit Systems Protection Board from her office as well. Both those individuals sued, and I believe maybe it was on Monday, that a judge said that the head of the Office of Special Counsel, that firing was illegal and that they put a stay on that firing until the case could go up to the Supreme Court. And then just this morning, the commissioner with the Merit System Protection Board, her firing was also stayed until that case could then make its way up to a higher court as well. So those two people now, at least as of now, have an injunction against their hiring. It's a temporary restraining order against their firing, and so they're essentially back on the job. We don't know how temporary they will be back on the job. It really depends upon what the Supreme Court decides, if the Supreme Court decides to accept those cases. So we're really in kind of, I always say moving sands type of situation, but we are in a very dynamic situation here where we have a White House that is really testing the limits of career civil service and seeing just what those civil service protections really are, and if the courts will uphold those types of civil service protections. But it is possible to terminate a career civil servant, but it has to be termination for a cause, and that cause must be documented with a pattern of subpar performance and then a pattern of offering opportunities for training and development. Now, all these phases in the human resource management process, we are just kind of hitting the very tip of the iceberg here in 500. You will get into a lot more details when you get into PPA 577, put a lot more what we call flesh on the bones, when you get a lot more detail in terms of all the different strategies you can use in those 4 different phases of human resource management. We are just kind of giving you that 30,000-foot helicopter view of what it looks like to manage human resources in public administration. But up to this point in time tonight, we've been talking primarily about career civil service protections. And those are, at least historically, have been very important protections, where career civil servants are protected from political arbitrary dismissal. We try to protect them from the influence of politics. But overlay on top of those career civil service protections, a lot of the protections that are afforded to employees by the collective bargaining process. Now, studies have shown us that public employees tend to be unionized at a much higher level than their private sector counterparts. Public employees tend to be unionized at about a 34, 35% level. Private sector employees are down around about 11, 12%. So it's about a 3 times higher chance that a public employee will be part of a union than a private sector employee. Unions are obviously important because when you have a unionized workforce, that unionized workforce will then have the ability to enter into collective bargaining negotiations with management to try and come up with a contract, a collective bargaining agreement. That collective bargaining agreement will then have stipulations in it that managers will need to adhere to as they are doing the human resource management process. Because of all the career civil service protections overlaid on top of all these collective bargaining agreement protections, the management of human resources become very complex and somewhat confusing for a lot of managers in public organizations. So much so that a lot of these organizations have decided to centralize the human resource management function within a human resource management office. Essentially, leave the human resource management to the human resource professionals. And so you've really seen this centralization of human resource management functions. That is a good thing if you are interested in human resource management and you want to go into a career in human resource management. There should be ample opportunities for you in human resource offices, in public agencies. So it really does open up that career opportunity for you. The downside is that obviously once you centralize things into an office, you kind of lose that personal touch. And once you have those decisions being made in a central office, those decisions tend to be made more remotely from where the actual provision and production of goods and services decisions are being made. And so sometimes the HR office doesn't really know or understand what these employees are doing on a daily basis or what they should be doing on a daily basis. So there are advantages and disadvantages to that type of centralization. But the whole purpose of the collective bargaining process is to create this contract, this collective bargaining agreement between the bargaining unit and agency management. Now, the types of issues that can be part of this collective bargaining process, the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over, will depend upon two things. One, it will depend upon the state that you are dealing with, because different states have different what we call permissive scopes of bargaining. Some states have much more permissive scopes than others. So you think about a state like Wisconsin, even a state like here in California, we tend to have relatively permissive scopes of bargaining in that we allow a broad range of issues to be negotiated over. Contrast that to the federal level. At the federal level, compensation is not within the permissive scope of collective bargaining, typically. And the reason why you cannot collectively bargain over compensation is that for most federal employees, compensation is established by the Congress. So since Congress establishes compensation levels, you cannot undo what Congress has done through a negotiation collective bargaining process. So for a lot of federal employees, compensation is off the bargaining table. That's weird for us at the state level because for a lot of state and local negotiations, compensation tends to be the primary thing that we are negotiating over. So it depends upon how permissive the scope of bargaining is. So it depends upon what the state law says about the scope of bargaining. Also, it depends upon the type of position that the employees occupy. If it's a position that has direct import for public safety, then some job actions may be limited by state statute. So if you're in a position that is directly related to public safety, you may be precluded from going on strike. That's why in police departments, we hear about the blue flu. The blue flu is where police officers, when they're in a contentious negotiating process, will call in sick from work. They're not going on strike because they may not be allowed to go on strike, but they call in sick, and it kind of has a similar type of an effect. Air traffic controllers, I used that example last week when we talked about the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Air traffic controllers in the early 1980s found that lesson out in a very hard way when Reagan fired them when they went on strike, and the FLRA upheld their firing, saying that air traffic controller, that has a direct connection, obviously, to public safety, so therefore they were precluded from going on strike. So those are two factors, if you will, how permissive the scope of bargaining is and the type of position we're talking about that really has an impact upon what types of issues can be collectively bargained over at the negotiating table. So the goal obviously is that the bargaining unit, negotiators from the bargaining unit, negotiators from the agency will come to the negotiating table in good faith, that they will engage in what is referred to as good faith bargaining. If, however, one of the parties is not engaging in good faith bargaining, the other party can then declare what's called an unfair labor practice, or a ULP. An unfair labor practice, if that is declared by one of the parties in the negotiating process, that unfair labor practice here in the state of California would go to an organization called CalPERB, P-E-R-B, that stands for the Public Employee Relation Board. So it would go to CalPERB. At the federal level, unfair labor practice claim would go, for most part, to the Federal Labor Relations Authority, unless you happen to be a postal worker. The U.S. Postal Service is not covered by the Federal Labor Relations Authority. They are covered by the National Labor Relations Board. And the National Labor Relations Board is the board that oversees collective bargaining in the private sector. And the reason why the U.S. Postal Service is under the NLRB as opposed to the FLRA is because the U.S. Postal Service, as we know from our previous discussions, is a government corporation. As a government corporation, they technically have the ability to run a profit, so they kind of feel and look and act a lot more like a corporation than perhaps a traditional government agency. But for the most part, these unfair labor practice claims at the federal level go to the FLRA, in California go to CalPERB. So what are some examples of unfair labor practices? Unfair labor practice could be if management does not allow employees to organize into a bargaining unit. So employees vote that they want to become a union, they want to form a bargaining unit, and management stops them from doing so. Under state law, that could be an unfair labor practice. Sometimes at the negotiation table, we'll have a party, especially management, that will engage in a practice known as regressive bargaining. Regressive bargaining is when, say, for instance, management, the agency will say, we are going to offer you a 3% annual raise. The bargaining unit for the employees comes back and says, we want a 5% annual raise. Management gets mad and says, we're going to reduce our offer down to a 1% raise, and that'll teach you. Problem with that is that's regressive bargaining. You cannot go backwards from your proposal. You can only work in the direction toward an agreement. You cannot go backwards. That would be regressive bargaining. That could be something that the union could then take that claim to CalPERB as an unfair type of labor practice because the management is not engaging in good faith bargaining. Good faith bargaining means both parties come to the table wanting to come to an agreement and wanting to work together to come to that agreement. A common type of collective bargaining that is used today is what's known as interest-based bargaining. And if you're really interested in this information, you'll get more of it in 577, but you can also get it in PPA 570, an elective course, Negotiating Dynamics. And in Negotiating Dynamics, Professor Gonchak will take you through some examples of different types of bargaining, interest-based bargaining, and other types of bargaining, kind of show you how they work. And then you also have the opportunity to engage in simulated bargaining opportunities too. And so it's a really great course if you are really interested in this idea of collective bargaining. Interest-based bargaining means that the two parties come into the negotiation process with the same interest, and that interest is to come to a workable agreement that is workable for both parties. If you have one party that comes in a collective bargaining process, they dig their heels in the sand and they do not want to come to an agreement, you're never going to be able to get a collective bargaining agreement. In order to try and make it easier to get these collective bargaining agreements done, organizations have also started doing what we call labor management initiatives. And labor management initiatives provide the opportunity for the negotiators from the bargaining unit to get together with the negotiators from the agency outside of the negotiation process. So they will get together in more of a social type of atmosphere to kind of build trust and rapport. In my district, and I always found this an interesting thing for them to engage in, the Labor Management Initiative actually had an axe throwing event, which I don't know if you want to throw axes while you're in a negotiation, but they would go to an axe throwing type of event in one of these axe throwing bars. And that was kind of their social interaction that they were having so that they could build that type of trust and rapport. The more trust and rapport there is in the negotiation process, obviously, the more likely it is that you can come to a negotiated settlement. But this is the real world. In the real world, sometimes we are unable to come to that negotiated settlement. Whenever the two parties are unable to come to a negotiated settlement, that's what we refer to as an impasse. Fortunately, we have some resolution strategies that can help us deal with an impasse. The first strategy there is what's called fact-finding. So if the two parties find themselves at loggerheads and cannot come to an agreement, the two parties can then declare an impasse. When an impasse is declared, they can then ask for fact-finding. What they will do is they will contract with an independent third-party fact-finder. That fact-finder will then come into the negotiation process, will collect information about all the different proposals that have been made and interview the parties on both sides of the table, and will then put together a fact-finding report. The fact-finding report does not make any recommendations. The fact-finding report doesn't come to a conclusion. The fact-finding report is just meant to present the facts of what has happened up to this point in time in the negotiation process. The fact-finding report, once it is completed, will then be embargoed for usually a 2-week period of time. And by embargoed, we mean that only the union and the management can see that fact-finding report for a period of 2 weeks. After those 2 weeks, the embargo is lifted and then it becomes public. The goal here is that by not making it public initially, the two parties get a chance to read the fact-finding report. And if one of the parties looks especially bad in that fact-finding report, that will put some pressure on them to come to an agreement before that fact-finding report goes public after the embargo ends. But fact-finding will not guarantee that you'll be able to resolve an impasse. It's just a step in the process. A second resolution procedure we can use is what's called mediation. And the federal government has an organization called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. The Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service employs, usually on a contractual basis, professional trained mediators that it can then send out to these different collective bargaining negotiations. When I was in college, one of my political science professors, who I have for a lot of classes, he was a trained negotiator, trained mediator, and worked with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. So we very rarely had class. It was before online education because I'm really old. So we had our in-person classes. He was never on campus because he was always jetting all over the country to try and do mediation, these collective bargaining processes. Mediation is, again, a step toward achieving an agreement, but it does not guarantee that an agreement will be achieved because typically it's non-binding in nature. It's just a way in which you can get the two parties together and have a trained mediator try and work out the differences. The third impasse resolution approach is what's called arbitration. If you really want to get an agreement, then a type of arbitration you can opt for is what's known as final offer binding arbitration. In final offer binding arbitration, a trained arbiter will come into the negotiation process and will literally say, union, give me your final offer. Management, give me your final offer. We'll then look at those two final offers and we'll select one. The offer that is then selected by the arbiter under final offer binding arbitration then becomes binding. That offer then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. That's a way in which you can ensure 100% that you will come to an agreement. However, you may win and you may lose. It's very much of what we call a zero-sum game, in that one party is going to win and one party is going to lose in the process. So it's a very high-stakes gamble to do final offer binding arbitration. It's usually your last step after you've already exhausted mediation and fact-finding. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that all negotiation happens at the collective bargaining table when we're renegotiating a new contract. There are discussions that go on outside of just that renegotiation of the contract. Here in California, we have a process that's known as meet and confer. So say, for instance, you have a situation, this happened regularly in my district during COVID, is because of COVID, you have a classification of employees who are working outside of their job description. So because of COVID, they're being asked to do things that are not within their job description. So they're being asked to do things to facilitate, online education, and that's not in their description. So those employees would say, I'm working outside my description. I want to file a grievance. They go to their union, and the union will then ask for a meet and confer with management. The union in a meet and confer will sit down with management at the table and will try and hammer out the differences on reconciling this working outside the job description. Now, it's not yet a grievance in that not being taken to CalPERB or not being an unfair labor practice yet. This meet and confer is supposed to try and hammer out an agreement before you get to that point in time. The way in which most of those agreements are hammered out in a meet and confer is not through the collective bargaining agreement, but rather through an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. It is sometimes in the best interest of the agency to give concessions to the union in a temporary memorandum of understanding as opposed to putting it into the collective bargaining agreement. Once something is put into the collective bargaining agreement, it is, for all intents and purposes, pretty much frozen, in that the union is probably not going to, the next time you do negotiation, say, okay, we're going to give this up and we're going to take this out of the collective bargaining agreement. Usually what the union wants to do is put more things in as opposed to taking things out. So once it goes in the CBA, it's part of the contract. It's probably going to be there for, if not ever, for the foreseeable future. However, if you can come to an agreement in a temporary type of deal with a memorandum of understanding, that's more temporary. And so that memorandum of understanding may be for 1 year, it may be for 2 years, and then it expires after that period of time. So it makes sense if you're dealing with a crisis situation like COVID that we were all hoping would eventually go away in a couple of years, that you would put this in the MOU, deal with it for that couple of years, because after COVID was over, then the need for these people to work outside their job descriptions probably would also cease as well. So you wouldn't have to have that provision in the collective bargaining agreement. There are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of nuances that go on in collective bargaining, but collective bargaining is very important for our discussion of public human resource management because it, again, overlays on top of the career civil service protections all these other protections that are afforded to public employees through their collective bargaining agreement. So the more unionization we have, the more likely we're going to have more limitations in terms of how we manage our human resources. Now, the future of unions is kind of up in the air because unions were dealt a very big blow by the courts a few years ago where they are limited now in terms of using their fair share dues to engage in political activities. And so what you can do as a member of a union is you can say, I do not want my dues used for these types of political activities, and then that money is not used for political activities. So there are a lot more limitations on the ability of unions to go out there and lobby Congress and to form these PACs and to spend this money in the furtherance of political campaigns. And so we'll see what happens in the future, but right now we've got those limitations that have certainly been applied to public sector employee unions. So that, again, from that 30,000-foot level is kind of an overview of how we manage human resources in the public sector. We spend time on it in this class because it is one of the, if not the major function of public administration. 85 to 90% of your agency's budget will go toward the management of human resources, either in terms of paying salaries, paying benefits, paying professional development. It will be related to human resources. Anything that consumes 85 to 90% of your operating budget is obviously something that is of great significance as a function in the field of public administration. And also, hopefully what this has done is this has given you a little bit of insight into some of the issues and topics you will talk about as you move on into your core course on human resource management, PPA 577. So, any questions or clarifications needed on any of this information up to this point in time in terms of the management of human resources? Again, I apologize, I'm talking a lot tonight, but I do want to make sure that we get through all the information that you will be held accountable for knowing to do a good job on the final assessment. So I want to make sure we get through all that information. So once we're done with class tonight, you'll be ready to go to do your final assessment and do as good of a job on the final assessment as everyone did on the midterm assessments. So I see we are looking at about 5:15. So I think it is high time for a break this evening. I know it's a little early, but this is a great breaking point between our two topics. So let's go ahead and take a break. Let's say we'll take a break until 5:25, about a 10-minute break, and then come back at 5:25 and we'll shift gears and move into our last function of public administration, the management of financial fiscal resources. So I will see you all back here in about 10 minutes. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. It is 5:25, so we'll move into our final topic that we covered here in PPA 500, and that's the management of financial resources. We have talked about this several times throughout the course, how important it is in the public sector that we are held accountable for how we are managing and spending public taxpayer money, and that mere fact that we are spending public taxpayer money really kind of sets us apart from what our counterparts in the private sector tend to do. When we talk about the management of financial resources in public administration, we are typically talking about public budgets. And in your 525 public budgeting course, you'll talk about a lot of different nuances involved with public budgets. We're going to just hit some of the highlights tonight so you have that information going into your 555 course. So where I usually like to start with a discussion of public budgets is, what is a budget? I think we all have a good sense, even if we haven't worked directly with a public budget, I think we all have a good sense of what a budget is. We know that a budget is a statement of dollars and cents. A public budget is a statement of, here is what we are going to spend our money on next fiscal year, and here is how much money we are going to spend. As such, a public budget is what I refer to as a prospective document. It looks into the future, into the next fiscal year. This is what we're spending our money on. This is how much money we are spending. However, the amount of money that we are spending will depend upon not only the amount of money that we have, but also the demands that are being placed upon us from our citizenry. So budgets are the result of the combination of finite resources and infinite demands. And how many times have we always heard that in the public sector, we need to do more with less? We need to create more output with fewer inputs. We always have finite resources, and the demands placed upon governments by citizens will always be an infinite set of demands. Whenever finite resources come into contact with infinite demands, it means there are going to be trade-offs. There'll be prioritization that will need to be done in determining what gets funded, what does not get funded, what gets a funding increase, what gets a funding decrease. Since there are finite resources, there's a finite amount of money. So that if we decide we're spending money on program A, by definition, it means that we don't have that money to then spend on program B. So we're always making these trade-offs and always prioritizing one area of spending over another area of spending. That means that a public budget goes beyond just being a statement of dollars and cents, and that a public budget really is a concise statement of societal priorities. If you want to know what that society or what that jurisdiction places a priority on at a given point in time, look at its budget. So if we decide we're going to spend more money on immigration enforcement and less money on education, it means the priority at that point in time is on immigration enforcement and a lower priority has been placed on education. So it really is very much the statement of societal priorities. Once you see a budget as a statement of societal priorities, it really kind of ups the ante a little bit. And it makes that budget even more important, even more substantial and significant than just a statement of dollars and cents. So as you move forward into your 525 class, I would really recommend that you try really hard to think about budgets as being these very important statements of priorities, as opposed to just how much money we're spending and what we're spending that money on. Now, there are two basic types of budgets. There are operating budgets and capital budgets. And this is true at the state and the local level, not really quite as true at the federal level. But at the state and local level, we have an operating, we have a capital budget. The operating budget is for those day-to-day functions of our organization, salaries, benefits, supplies, those types of things that are required for the day-to-day functioning of an organization. Those things are paid for out of our operating budget. Then state and local governments maintain a separate budget known as a capital budget. Capital budgets are for those long lifespan, high price tag types of items that do not recur every single year. Salaries and benefits, that's something that will be recurring every single year. A construction of a city hall, construction of an aquatic center, those are things that are non-recurring in nature. And so we want to give more time and more thought to whether or not we want to fund those projects. So we segregate those projects onto a separate capital budget, and then we plan for those projects through what's called a capital improvement plan. Now, another reason why we put those capital projects into a separate capital budget is not just for additional time and scrutiny for planning, but we also put them in a separate budget because if we would include a, say, $100 million city hall project into a city's operating budget, it would blow a massive hole into that operating budget. It would make it impossible for that city to balance its revenues and expenditures. And by state law, at least here in California and the vast majority of states, local governments must balance their revenues and expenditures. They are precluded from running a deficit. Now, at the federal level typically does not maintain a separate capital budget because they don't need to. They don't need to because the size and scope of the federal budget is so large. If you would put a $100 million capital project into the federal budget, it's a drop in the ocean. And it's just a pebble in the ocean. You don't really even realize it. So we maintain separate operating capital budgets at the state and local level. We usually use more of a unified budget at the federal level. So what does the process of public budgeting look like? And what types of functions do we go through as we put together a public budget? Well, the answer to that is obviously going to be it depends. It depends upon the level of government that we're looking at. If we're looking at the state level, it depends upon the state because every state has different processes and procedures that it will use to put its state budget together. But overall, the general budgeting process consists of 4 different phases: preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. So the first phase of the budgeting process is preparation. This occurs well before the fiscal year begins. And what we're going to do is we talk about the process of budgeting. We're going to use the federal budget process kind of as our guidepost. And then I will point out here and there where the California state process parts company and differs from the federal process. We're going to just kind of use that federal process as a template. So at the federal level, in preparation will begin usually at least a year or so before the beginning of the new fiscal year. At the federal level, the fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. Here in California, for most state agencies, the fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So we operate on a different fiscal year calendar here in California as opposed to at the federal level. So the preparation phase is where we figure out how much money we have to spend and then how much money we're going to have to spend to continue doing the types of things we did in the last fiscal year. So one thing we'll do in the preparation phase is we'll create what are called revenue forecasts. The 2 organizations that do most of the work on these revenue forecasts, the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as OMB, it's an executive level organization that serves the president, and then CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. And the Congressional Budget Office kind of serves as a counterweight, a counterbalance to the Office of Management and Budget, provides resources and information on the budget to the U.S. Congress. So OMB and CBO will do their revenue forecast to determine how much revenue we can anticipate having next year, because we need to know how much revenue we have before we know how much revenue we can spend. Then the other thing that they do is they create these things called expenditure estimates. And what OMB will do is create something called current service estimates. And those current service estimates, OMB will ask the relatively simple question: how much will it cost us next fiscal year to do the same level of services that we provided this fiscal year? because as we know, as we move from one year to the next, the value of money changes. We have inflationary factors. And so doing the same thing you did last year will probably be more costly next fiscal year. So how much will it cost us next year to just simply do what we did this past fiscal year? So they'll produce these revenue forecasts and these expenditure estimates. It doesn't mean that the results are always the same. Usually the results are different from each other because they use different types of methodologies. OMB is serving the president, CBO is serving Congress. OMB serving the president is serving one singular political actor. And so OMB is very much in alignment with the goals and objectives of the policy aims of the president. CBO is serving 535 members of Congress, so it doesn't have the same singular type of direction. So usually the forecasts that we get in terms of revenue from OMB tend to be much more optimistic than the revenue forecast we get coming out of CBO. So OMB and CBO provide these forecasts and these estimates. OMB, as the central clearinghouse for the president's budget, will then put out a call for budget requests, what used to be known as Circular A-22. It's a request for agencies and departments across the federal government to put together their budget requests for the next fiscal year. Those budget requests then get submitted to the Office of Management and Budget. OMB will then review those requests, will most likely make changes and reductions to those requests, and then those lowered, revised requests will then be cobbled together into the president's budget. Typically, in terms of scheduling, the president's budget is usually delivered to Congress by the beginning of February. Now, it's a little bit different this year, and it's different in the first year of the term of a president. Usually, first-year presidents will get a little bit of a break in terms of the schedule. They oftentimes won't submit their budget to Congress until maybe March or April. But usually what will happen is you have a State of the Union address that occurs typically in late January. Once the State of the Union address is over, then at the beginning of February, usually the first or second week, the president will then release their budget to not only the public, but also to Congress. Once the president's budget is released to Congress, we then shift from the preparation phase to the formulation phase. So in the second phase of the budgeting process, this is where the legislative body goes to work. This is where they go to work reviewing the president's budget and making changes to the president's budget. So let's pause for one second and look at what California does and how California kind of differs. In California, the governor submits their budget bill, and it's a singular budget bill, to the state legislature in January. So technically, the formulation process in California begins in January, begins a little bit earlier than it would begin at the federal level. Let's shift back to the federal level. So in formulation, beginning of February, when the president's budget goes to Congress, its starting point is to go to the budget committees. And there is a budget committee in the House and a budget committee in the Senate. The job of the House and Senate budget committees are to pass what's called a concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget will establish maximum spending limits across all the different programmatic areas of the budget. So across all the 12 areas of education, agriculture, health and human services, defense, veterans affairs, and commerce, treasury, across all those different categories, we will then have a maximum amount of money that is allowed to be spent under this concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget is meant to be passed by April 15th, and it's not a coincidence that it has to be passed by tax day. So by April 15th, we have to get this concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget does not require presidential action. It is a resolution, and resolutions of Congress do not require the signature of the president. So by the middle of April, we now have these maximum allowable spending amounts for each one of our programmatic areas across the budget. From that point, then the budget will go to the appropriations committees. There is one appropriations committee in the House, and there is one appropriations committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have 12 different subcommittees. one subcommittee for each of the different areas of spending in the budget. So again, an education appropriations subcommittee, defense appropriations subcommittee, and so on and so on. Each one of those subcommittees will then pass out, they'll have hearings and they'll do markup and amendments of a appropriation bill. They will then pass their appropriation bill out to the parent appropriations committee. The parent appropriations committee will then hold their hearings, will then do their markup, and will then pass the appropriation bills out to the floor of the House and to the floor of the Senate. Now, this is the process that is used for a type of spending that is known as discretionary spending. There are two different types of spending in the federal budget process. There's discretionary spending and there is mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress decides we want to spend less money on program A, they can decide to spend less money on program A. They have direct control over it. It's within their discretion. Discretionary spending goes through this appropriations process, and that goes through the creation of these appropriation bills, through the subcommittees, and through the House Appropriations Committee, and then those appropriation bills go to the floor of the House and to the floor of the Senate. The second type of spending is called mandatory spending. This is spending that Congress does not have direct control over changing. So things such as interest on the national debt. Once Congress borrows money, Congress enters into a legal obligation to repay that debt. So there's no wiggle room for Congress in terms of repaying that debt. So interest on the debt is mandatory. It's required to be done. Another type of mandatory spending is something like an entitlement program. Entitlement programs, as you are probably aware, are a type of public policy that people are legally entitled to the benefits of those programs if they meet the legal requirements, if they meet the statutory requirements. So Social Security, a lot of people don't think about it as such, but Social Security is an entitlement program that once you meet retirement age and you are vested in Social Security, you are then legally entitled to those Social Security benefits. A lot of our social welfare programs are redistributive, as we talked about last week, are redistributive programs, and they tend to be mandatory in nature in that they're entitlement programs. That if you meet the eligibility requirements, you are legally entitled to get those benefits. Since Congress does not have direct discretion over reducing spending on those mandatory programs, if Congress wants to reduce spending on a mandatory program, Congress must change the eligibility requirements. So if you want to spend less money on Social Security, then you're going to have to change the eligibility requirements for Social Security. You may want to raise the retirement age or make it more difficult or longer for people to be totally vested in Social Security. Then you would have less people who are legally eligible for it, and you would then end up, by definition, spending less money on Social Security. Mandatory spending does not go through the appropriations process. It goes through a separate process known as the authorization process. And just like we have these appropriations committees, we then have authorization committees as well. And they will handle the reauthorization of these types of mandatory spending programs. So we kind of have a two-bar process going on, appropriations and then authorization, depending on whether it's discretionary or whether it is mandatory spending. The goal of the budgeting process at the federal level in formulation is that by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, Congress will have passed all 12 appropriation bills, and those 12 appropriation bills will have gone to the president's desk, and the president will have signed all 12 of those appropriation bills in time for the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. That doesn't happen. It is extremely rare these days to get all 12 appropriation bills passed by Congress by September 30th. We may get 3, or we may get 4, we may get 5, but we typically do not get all of them passed. So what happens? If we do not pass all 12 appropriation bills by the beginning of the new fiscal year, those agencies and departments where their appropriation bills have not yet been passed and signed by the president, they no longer have the legal authority to go out there and spend money. So what we end up is we have to decide what we're going to do. One thing that Congress typically does is it will pass what's called a CR, a continuing resolution. The continuing resolution will say, Department of Treasury, your appropriation bill has not yet been passed, but we will pass this resolution to allow you to spend 80% of what you spent for this period of time last year. And these continuing resolutions are temporary. So we might say we're going to allow you to spend 80% of what you spent for the month of October last year, and this continuing resolution will then expire at the end of October. So it provides them with the funding they need to keep the process going, to keep paying their bills, and to keep making their payroll, at least until that continuing resolution expires. If that resolution expires and we do not have agreement on the appropriation bill yet, then Congress passes another continuing resolution, another stopgap measure for another maybe 2 or 4 weeks, and so on and so on. So we'll get this series of continuing resolutions. Eventually, Congress and or the president will tire of continuing resolutions. And when they tire of continuing resolutions, then we end up with the prospect of a partial government shutdown. And we've seen some prominent examples of partial government shutdown over the past several years. We saw one in 2018 in the Trump administration. In a partial government shutdown, all those agencies and departments that do not have legal authorization to spend money, they can't spend money. So they tell their employees, you are furloughed, stay home, do not come to work, and they shut down their operations. It's only partial because it's only for those agencies and departments that don't have the appropriation bills yet passed. Usually people want to avoid a partial government shutdown because a partial government shutdown typically hurts both the president as well as Congress, and certainly hurts federal employees and certainly hurts citizens as well. When citizens start calling up the IRS asking for help on their taxes, and there's nobody at the IRS to answer those phone calls or to respond to those emails, then you're going to hear a great hue and cry coming from citizens. So that's what's called a partial government shutdown. What will oftentimes happen, whether we have a partial government shutdown or a series of continuing resolutions, is we will finally come to an agreement on the budget using a device known as an OBRA. And an OBRA stands for an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. In an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, what we will do is Congress will take all those appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, they will cobble them all together into this massive piece of legislation called an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. When they put all these appropriation bills together into this mammoth piece of legislation, they end up spending a lot more money. And so this is where a lot of your pork barrel spending comes from. A lot of your excessive spending comes in the form of this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. These OBRAs tend to be so detailed and so lengthy that we oftentimes, members of Congress don't know exactly what's in an OBRA until sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later. And you always have to do what we call log rolling, where you will say, if you will support this OBRA, I will give you this project that you want in the budget that you weren't able to get in the original appropriation bill. And again, that's how it leads to a lot of this pork barrel spending. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts are easier to pass because they're part of what's called the reconciliation process. The reconciliation process was something that was created by Congress back in the 1970s in the Budget Impoundment Control Act, and reconciliation allows you an expedited process for passing budgets in Congress. So if you're going to pass a budget through reconciliation, what you can do is you can avoid amendments to that piece of legislation. You can greatly reduce, if not completely eliminate, discussion on that piece of that OBRA. And so it makes it much easier and much quicker to pass. Also in the Senate, in the reconciliation process, filibusters are much easier to break than they normally would be for traditional pieces of legislation. Now, if you know the way in which the Senate works, one way that the minority party can slow down consideration of legislation is through a filibuster. So they can get up there and they can just talk nonstop and just slow down the consideration of legislation. In order to stop a filibuster, you need what's called a vote of cloture, which is a vote of 60 members of the Senate. So if you don't have 60 members of the Senate to support a piece of legislation, it's not going to make it through the Senate because it'll just be filibustered to death. The reconciliation process allows you to break a filibuster without a supermajority of 60, and you can actually pass that over with a simple majority. So it makes it much easier to pass these budget bills with an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. If it sounds confusing, it is. And there are people who've been in the Senate. Mitch McConnell is very famous for saying that he's been in the Senate over 30 years, and he still doesn't understand all the nuances in the federal budget process. But however we do it, if we do it through an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or if we do it through the normal convention of passing all 12 appropriation bills, once we have all those bills that have been passed, the new fiscal year has to begin. We can't hold up the beginning of the new fiscal year. So when the new fiscal year begins on October 1st, we transition from formulation into the third phase, which is execution. This is where we actually spend the money. And execution will last for that current fiscal year from October 1st until the following September 30th. Now let's take a little break here and compare it to how this all works in the state of California. So we said formulation begins a little bit early. It begins in January when the governor's budget goes to the state legislature for consideration. However, we have this little device in California known as the May revise. The May revise comes out in the middle of May. From the time in which the governor put together their budget in January to May, a lot of things may have changed. We may be running behind on the amount of revenue that we're generating. We're not generating as much revenue as we thought we were going to generate. If our revenue generation levels are down, it means that we have less money to spend. So we're going to have to probably peel back on some of those programs and some of that proposed spending that was in the governor's budget. So we get the May revise in the middle of May where we are told, well, here's the amount of money we actually have to spend. So here are the changes that are being made to the governor's budget bill. The work of the state legislature really starts in earnest after that May revise, because then they know exactly how much money they have to play with in considering the governor's budget. May revise usually leads to a reduction in spending. There have been some years where our revenues were actually higher than we thought. During COVID, it sounds kind of nonsensical, but during COVID, we actually were running ahead of our revenue forecast. And that was because a lot of this federal money that was coming in to try and help the state deal with COVID. Now, this year, we've seen some cuts because of as a result of the May revise. And so, the May revise really does have a major impact. And I think that we're going to see in this May revise some more cuts that are going to be added to the budget from the governor back in January. So based on that May revise, then the state legislature will get to work in earnest on the governor's budget. State law requires that the state budget be passed by the state legislature no later than June 15th, then be signed by the governor no later than June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. Now, here in California, we have a much easier time getting our budgets done on time as compared to the federal level. And that's a function of two different factors. One reason why it's easier here in California is one-party dominance. We know that in the Assembly as well as in the Senate, the Democratic Party has huge majorities. It has greater than 2/3 and very close to 3/4 majorities in the Assembly as well as the Senate. Plus, the governor is also a Democrat. So when you have that type of unified government, it makes it much easier to pass a budget because they kind of share a lot of the same budget priorities. Also, it's also become easier to pass the budget because of changes that we have made to state law in Prop 13. So in the past, in order to pass a budget through the state legislature, you had to have a 2/3 majority. We have changed that, so now it's only a simple majority. You still need 2/3 to increase fees and increase taxes, but to just pass the budget, you only need a simple majority, and that's proven to be a very easy task to do. So we almost always get our budgets done on time and in place by the beginning of the fiscal year on July 1st. However, we also have this very interesting and different type of technique that are known as trailer bills. So even when the budget bill is passed and signed by the governor and we begin the new fiscal year, we will still have the need for passing what are called trailer bills, bills that trail after the passage of the budget. These trailer bills will then add in all the specific details in terms of how this state money will be spent. So who gets the state money? What are the eligibility requirements? What's the sequencing of these payments? That information will come in the form of these trailer bills that will be passed after the budget has already been passed and the new fiscal year has begun. The consequence of that is that some local governments, even though the fiscal year begins on July 1st, they are hesitant to go out there and start spending the money that they have been appropriated because they're going to wait for these trailer bills to be passed to make sure they're spending that money in the way in which they are required to spend the money. I know when I was on the board in my district, we would usually hold off on a lot of our expenditures through the month of July and into August, waiting for those trailer bills to be passed so we'd have more guidance in how to implement those appropriations that we got from the state government. So in the state of California, once we hit July 1st, we're in the new fiscal year. We then move into this execution phase, and that's when we are spending the money. Then at the shift back to the federal level, then once the fiscal year ends, then we move into evaluation. This is where we go back and audit the books. This is where we go back and we look at not only how do we spend the money, did we spend the money in those legally appropriated manner that we're supposed to, but how well did we spend the money? So use a combination of financial legal audits and performance management audits that we talked about in class last week, and do a similar thing then here in California. Here in California, we have corollary agencies to OMB and CBO. So in California, the corollary agency to OMB is the Department of Finance. So the Department of Finance is kind of our mini OMB that serves the governor. Then our mini CBO here in California is the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office. And so those are our organizations here in California that, I hate to say mirror because they do different things, but kind of mirror the functions of OMB and CBO at the federal level. So that's kind of the process of budgeting. Those are the 4 phases we go through, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level. It's just the way we go through those phases is a little bit different here in California as compared to at the national level. So what do budgets look like? I think we have a good sense now of what a budget is. We have a good sense of operating versus capital budgets. I think we have a good sense as well of the process and how we put these budgets together. So the next question is, what do budgets look like? And there are 4 primary budget formats that we are going to talk about here in this class, different types of budgets. You'll talk about more of those once you get into public budgeting. You'll also talk about these in more detail. So we're going to just kind of hit the highlights in terms of how they work and what are their advantages and their disadvantages. I do have links provided for you in our Canvas site to show you specific examples of what these 4 budget formats look like to kind of get you ready then for your 555 course. The first budget format is called a line item budget. And a line item budget is your traditional, very simple, very easy type of budget format. This is the type of budget format that is used primarily at the local government level because, again, it is so easy to do and it is very low cost and very low in terms of time required. Line item budgets are also known as object of expenditure budgets. So because they're called line item, every line on that budget will be a different object of expenditure. So this is what we're spending money on. Here we're spending money on salaries. And then here's the amount of money that we're spending on salaries. Here's a line item for benefits. Here's the amount of money that we're spending on benefits. Here's a line item for supplies. Here's the amount of money that we are spending on supplies. Very simple line item budget, tells you what you're spending your money on and how much money you're spending on each one of those expenditures. The advantage is very easy and very simple to do, and it also contributes to our need to control our expenditures. And so there's a very famous budgeting scholar by the name of Alan Schick. And Alan Schick tells us that different budget formats can be used for different purposes. A line item budget is used for the purpose of using your budget document for control, to control how much money we're spending and to control what we are spending that money on. The downside, the problem, let me mute that. The downside, the problem that we are dealing with a line item budget is that because it is so simple, we don't get a lot of information. So we don't get a lot of information about how well we are spending the money. We know how we're spending it, how much we're spending. We don't know how well we're spending that money. The only information we have to prepare this year's line item budget is what we spent money on and how much money we spent in last fiscal year's line item budget. If you want to use your budget document for more than just to control your spending, and you actually want to use your budget document for the purpose of better managing the operations of your organization, you would use something like a performance-based budget. So a performance-based budget, according to Alan Schick, will emphasize the purpose of management, using your budget as a management tool. So with a performance-based budget, what we will do is we'll take a traditional line on a budget, and then we'll add on performance indicators. And so say, for instance, you have a performance-based budget for a police department. So in that line on a budget, you would say, here's the amount of money that we're spending on police patrols. And that would be a simple line on a budget. In a performance-based budget, we will ask the question, how does the activity of police patrols and the number of hours we're funding of police patrols, how does that impact something such as the number of burglaries? So we would assume that the number of burglaries go up, then we're not doing a very efficient or effective job of spending that money on police patrols. So we will incorporate performance indicators into our line on a budget, which then makes it a performance-based budget. Now we can ask the question, how well are we spending the money? How well are we accomplishing our goals and our objectives? A third type of budget format that you'll talk about in 555 is a program-based budget. Now, a program-based budget is a lot different in that a program-based budget is organized differently than a line item or performance-based budget. Line item and performance-based budgets are organized according to units, divisions, and departments. So you'll have, here is the police department's budget. Here is the fire department's budget. And they will be separate budgets because they're separate departments. In a program-based budget, we don't budget according to department, we budget according to program. So take, for instance, this example of police and fire. Police and fire departments both contribute to a program such as the protection of persons and property. There are police activities like police patrols and things like that that will contribute to the protection of persons and property. Fire suppression will also, the protection of structures will also contribute to the protection of persons and property. So since those activities in the police and fire department both contribute to the program goal of protection of persons and property, we would budget them together under the heading protection of persons and property. So the budget is organized around program as opposed to being organized around division or department. That allows us to use the budget document for the purpose of planning. We can use the budget document to strategically plan the operations of our organization. So it's very easy to tell if you're dealing with a program-based budget. And when you get into the 555 class, you'll probably be looking at different city budgets. It's easy to recognize a program budget because it's organized around the program as opposed to the department. Then the fourth type of budget format is what's called a zero-based budget. This is more of a process than it is a finalized budget document. In zero-based budgeting, what we will do is we will require the agency to go back and re-justify why it is spending money on certain types of programs and activities. Under line item performance and program, you kind of took as an assumption that we funded these things last year, so we're going to continue funding them this year. In zero-based budgeting, you have to go back and re-justify why all those programs and activities will be funded in this new fiscal year. Zero-based budgeting is very much of a bottom-up process. So what we will do is we'll look at our agency and we'll identify the lowest level in our agency where budget decisions can be made. That is what's known as a decision unit. All of those decision units will then put together what they call decision packages, different types of alternatives for funding activities. So really quickly, for instance, you may have a decision package for, let's say it's a bookmobile program for a county library. And so one alternative for funding would be to fund this bookmobile at 90% of what we funded it last year, a 10% budget cut. Well, what are the consequences of a 10% budget cut? The consequences would probably be we would be able to serve less clients, Our circulation rates would probably go down. Those are some of the consequences of 90% funding level. Well, another alternative could be 100% funding level. So we fund it at exactly what we funded it at last year. What are the consequences of that? We're probably going to be able to serve fewer residents just because the cost of doing business has increased because of inflationary changes. But it'll be an incremental decrease in the number of people that we can serve, maybe an incremental decrease in our circulation rates. A third alternative could be to fund it at 110%, so a 10% increase. Well, that means we can serve X number additional patrons. Our circulation rates, we will assume, will go up by X percentage. Those are the consequences of funding it at 110%. So those decision packages will then get ranked and prioritized at the decision unit level. Those prioritized decision packages will then get sent up the organization chart, and then the highest ranked and prioritized decision packages then become part of that agency's budget. So it's a very kind of democratic, bottom-up way of doing budgeting. The problem with zero-based budgeting is that it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. In producing these decision packages, you're going to be producing hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands upon thousands of pages of decision packages. So you spend all your time putting the budget together, and you have very little time to actually go out there and spend the money. But zero-based budgeting, when it can be done, it's usually done in a modified version, where we'll say, we'll take 80% of our budget as assumed, kind of like line item budgeting. But then for 20% of our budgeting, we'll subject it to the zero-based budgeting process. The next year, we'll subject another 20%. The next year, another 20%, and so on, so that every 5 years, the parts of the budget will at least go through the zero-based budgeting process at least once. Zero-based budgeting is, again, very good to use for the planning function. It allows you to take a very rational, comprehensive decision-making approach to why you're spending the money on the programs and activities you're spending money on. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to take you through the examples, but they are on our Canvas site. If you're interested, you can go and click on those links and take a look at those examples. But this is all information that you are going to talk about much more at length in your 555 course. For our purposes here in 500, it's just basically to know what these four budget formats are, know what their advantages and disadvantages are, and then be able to know when to apply them. So if you have a city that is very strapped for cash, you're probably not going to be able to do zero-based budgeting or program-based budgeting. If you've got a city that's done no strategic planning in the past few years, it's probably not going to be able to do program-based budgeting, zero-based budgeting, or even probably performance-based budgeting. So it really depends upon the situation. There is no one best budget format. It depends, my favorite answer, depends upon the context of the situation. But up to this point in time, we have talked primarily about expenditures, the money that we are spending. Let's look at the other side of the equation and look at revenue, the money that is coming into government coffers. We know that we get revenue as governments from tax-based sources of revenue, and we can also generate revenue from non-tax sources of revenue. So in terms of tax-based sources of revenue, the big three are property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes. Property taxes are considered to be a wealth-based tax, and we are tax you based upon your ability to pay. Your ability to pay is measured by the assessed value of your property. Higher the assessed value of your property, the more the ability to pay you have, the higher your tax bill will be in terms of property taxes. Now, we know here in California, we have this little thing called Proposition 13 and later on Proposition 19. Proposition 13 was meant to limit property tax liability for homeowners. And so what Proposition 13 does is it limits the property tax rate to a 1% tax rate. Now, your tax rate may be a little bit above that because there are local add-ons, but it's a statewide 1% property tax rate limitation. And then the assessed value of your property for tax purposes can only increase by a maximum of 2% per year. So if you combine a 1% rate limit with that 2% assessment limit, it overall limits the amount of money that local governments can generate from the property tax. So what governments have done is they have moved away from the property tax and have shifted more to non-tax sources of revenue. The property tax tends to be the most hated form of taxation. And it's the most hated form of taxation because it is a very visible type of tax. Unless you have your property taxes impounded into escrow, meaning rolled into your mortgage payment, then you're going to twice per year get a very large and probably you'll consider a very obnoxious property tax bill. The more visible a tax is, the more hated that tax tends to be. And so it's the least liked form of taxation. The preferred form of taxation among the voters tends to be the income tax. Now, property taxes exist primarily at the local level. Income taxes exist primarily at the national as well as the state level. In other states, income taxes will exist at the local level as well, but we don't deal with that here in California. Income taxes are seen as fairer than the property tax because income taxes are based upon a graduated marginal income tax system, meaning that the higher your income level, the more you will pay in income taxes. And it's a marginal tax bracket system, meaning that if your income level puts you at the 33% tax rate, you do not pay every dollar of your income at 33%. You'll pay the first increment of your income at 10%, then every dollar above that will be at 15% up to another income threshold, then every dollar above that will be at 20% or 22%, and so on and so on. That is meant to try and shield taxpayers from too onerous of an income tax burden. But the idea of having this graduated tax system where people who make more money pay more in income taxes makes the income tax, at least on face value, a what we call a progressive type of tax. And there is always this tension between progressive versus regressive forms of taxation. A progressive form of taxation is one in which people with more of an ability to pay a higher rate in taxation than people with less of an ability to pay. That's a progressive form of taxation. That's the income tax, at least in theory. Of course, we have a whole lot of loopholes in the federal income tax code that have resulted in billionaires paying single-digit effective tax rates, and that's not the way the system is supposed to work, but that's the way the system has worked over the years. But at least in theory, it's a progressive form of taxation. Regressive is the opposite. So if people at lower income brackets are paying more in taxation than people at higher income brackets, that form of taxation is considered to be regressive. And the type of taxation that tends to be regressive is that third type of tax on the screen, a sales-based or consumption-based type of tax. Sales taxes are different. Property taxes and income taxes were based upon an ability to pay type of idea. Sales taxes are based upon a benefits received principle. You pay taxes and sales taxes based upon the benefits that you get from purchasing and consuming some type of a commodity. So you purchase that candy bar, you purchase that car, you're going to get a benefit from that purchase that you are making and from consuming that purchase. Since it's based upon a benefits received principle, it can be possible for people to be hurt by the sales tax if they are in lower income levels. And the reason for that is that if you do not exempt the staples of life, things like pharmaceutical medication, certain types of food, in some states clothing up to a certain value amount, if you don't exempt those staples of life, then lower income individuals are going to be hurt by that taxation because they have less disposable income left over after purchasing those staples of life. So if you don't have the right set of commodity exemptions, sales taxes will become very, very regressive. Sales taxes tend to fall into two general categories: general sales taxes and then what we call selective excise taxes. General sales taxes will be a sales tax rate that applies to the broad swath of commodities that are transacted in a jurisdiction. We have a sales tax rate at the state level. We then also have local option sales tax rates so that different counties will have their own local option sales tax. And so the local option sales tax in Los Angeles County is higher than the one in Kern County. The one up in San Francisco is going to be higher than the one in Los Angeles County. So there's a lot of variation in terms of those local option sales taxes. But that's a general sales tax. Then we can also apply sales taxes differently to different types of commodities. Those are called selective excise taxes. So selective excise taxes such as a luxury tax. So maybe we want to put a luxury tax on yachts because we assume that the people who are purchasing yachts have more of an ability to pay. And so we'll place a tax on those yachts, and then we will shield lower income taxpayers from that sales tax because they're not purchasing the yachts. Well, the externality of that is obviously the more expensive yachts become, the less yachts we purchase, the less they are purchased, the less demand there is, the less demand, the less supply, which means we're going to stop producing yachts, and those workers in the shipyards are then going to be out of work. So you have to be really careful with who you are targeting with these types of selective excise taxes. Another example of a selective excise tax is the motor fuels tax. This is a benefit-based type of selective excise tax. So the motor fuels tax, we will place a tax on gasoline, and then we will capture the revenue generated from that gas tax, and we will then ostensibly, in theory, use that revenue to then pay for road construction and road reconstruction. Another example of a selective excise tax is a sumptuary or a sin tax. So a tax on tobacco products. Tax on tobacco products is usually sold based upon the argument that if we add this tax to tobacco, it will make tobacco more expensive, which will reduce the demand, which will reduce consumption, which will reduce this socially undesirable behavior. However, they're also sold on the fact that, well, we're going to raise more revenue with these sin taxes. You can't have it both ways. If you're reducing the consumption of a good, then you're probably going to be able to generate less revenue in terms of the sales tax because less of that good is going to be transacted. People tend to really like sin taxes because of this phenomenon known as burden shifting. People much prefer a tax where they can shift the burden of that tax from themselves onto someone else. And you can do that with the tobacco tax. You don't smoke tobacco products, you don't have to purchase them, you don't pay the tax, you shift that tax onto people who do consume tobacco products. So those are some of our major tax-based sources of revenue that you'll learn more about in public budgeting. And then we have our non-tax sources of revenue, things like user charges and user fees. Now, admittedly, a lot of local governments will use those terms, user charge and user fee, interchangeably with each other. However, they are different. A user charge is usually associated with the consumption of some type of a service. So if you're consuming a utility service, you pay a user charge for the utilities, the amount of utilities that you are consuming. So user charges are usually attached to the consumption of some type of a service. User fees, by contrast, are usually not attached to the consumption of a service. They are attached to the privilege of engaging in a certain type of behavior. So you want to drive on the roads in California, you have to have a driver's license, and then you have to pay a fee for that driver's license. You want to hunt and fish, you have to have a hunting and fishing license, you have to have pay a fee for that hunting and fishing license. You will want to open up a franchise. You're going to have to get a license for that franchise and pay a franchise fee. It's a way in which governments can not only generate money, but they can also regulate the behavior of people who are engaging in those types of things, such as hunting, fishing, driving a car, and starting up a franchise. User charges and user fees have, in a lot of cities, overtaken property tax revenue as the primary source of revenue. If you look at the average city here in California, the average city here in California derives more of its revenue from non-tax revenue sources, such as user charges and user fees, as opposed to the property tax. Now, it's a little bit different here in Southern California. A lot of our cities in Southern California are still pretty reliant upon the property tax. But in the wake of Proposition 13, when they were limited in the amount of property tax revenue they could generate, they had to look elsewhere. And a lot of cities started looking to these non-tax sources of revenue. So now that we've talked about expenditures and we have talked about revenue, the next topic in public budgeting is to look at what happens when there is an imbalance between the amount of revenue we're generating and the amount of money that we're spending. An imbalance between revenues and expenditures is what's referred to as a deficit. So when our expenditures are more than our revenues in one given fiscal year, we then have a deficit in that fiscal year. Now, most state and local governments are precluded from running a deficit. They are not allowed to run a deficit. The federal government has no such prohibition. And so ever since 1969, except for 2 years, we have run a deficit at the national level. So we're very familiar with deficits in the national government. Deficits are a little bit different than debts. Now, if you run a deficit every single year, the accumulation of those deficits will then add to your national debt. And that's what's happening here for us at the national level. The interest that we are paying on the national debt now consumes more than 1/3 of all the expenditures that we make at the national level. That is a terrifying number because our debt continues to get bigger and bigger. Part of the debt is because of this accumulation of these deficits year after year after year. However, not all debt is the accumulation of deficits. Not all debt is bad. There are good purposes that you can use debt for. So debt is the borrowing of money. When we want to fund our capital projects, so you want to fund that aquatic center, you want to fund that recreation center, that city hall, you are probably going to issue debt. You're going to borrow money. Because if you have a $100 million project and you have to raise $100 million in year one so you can have the money to construct this project, if you want to raise $100 million by increasing your taxpayer rates, it's going to be cost prohibitive. You just can't increase rates that much. So instead, what you do is you issue debt, and then the proceeds you get from investors purchasing that debt, you then use those proceeds to construct the facility, and then you repay that debt over 20 or 30 or 40 years. So it's a much more reasonable way in which we can get the money that we need to fund these very high price tag types of capital projects. There are two different types of debt. There's long-term debt and short-term debt. And again, this long-term debt discussion is going to be germane for that scenario on the final assessment. Whenever governments issue long-term debt, they are basically issuing what are called bonds. So when a local government issues a bond, it is borrowing money. So it issues a bond, investors come along and purchase those bonds, and then they get the return of their principal and interest payments back from the government over a period of time. Now, we know that whenever you're investing in any type of a bond or any type of investment, investors have this relationship between risk and reward. The higher the risk of the investment, the more reward they are going to anticipate getting. The lower the risk, the lower the reward they're willing to tolerate. That's the same type of thing with bonds. So if you have a type of bond, the first type of bond, which is known as a general obligation bond. The general obligation bond is the traditional type of bond that a lot of local governments traditionally would issue. General obligation bonds are very low risk types of investments because whenever governments issue a general obligation bond, they pledge what is known as their full faith and credit to repay the debt. So in the full faith and credit means they will use everything at their disposal, whether it be laying off employees, if they statutorily can. It could be from cutting other programs. It could be from deferring preventive maintenance. They will do whatever they need to do in order to repay the investors the money that will be owed on that debt. So they will do anything they have to repay the debt. So this is a very big give on the part of local government, saying that we'll do whatever we have to do. This is our full faith and credit as a governmental authority. Since you are giving the full faith and credit, then what that means is that the investors know they're getting their money back. And when they know they're getting their money back, then they anticipate a lower reward. So you can issue these bonds at a lower interest rate and save yourself money as a government by issuing a general obligation bond. And Barry has a good question in text chat. What if they don't repay? If a government defaults on its debt and does not repay its debt, then the government will see its credit rating destroyed. And so Standard & Poor's and Moody's, those credit rating agencies, if you default on a debt, credit rating will go down. It'll probably go down from, if you're at a AA level, probably down to a B minus or maybe a C level. At that level, you will not be able to issue debt in the future. So it's kind of like us in our personal lives. If our credit rating gets bad enough, we're not able to go out there and get car loans or mortgages or credit cards. Same type of thing with cities. So it's very important that they do not default on their debt. So they have to be very careful in terms of issuing these general obligation bonds. So the good thing about general obligation bond is they are cheap because they carry lower interest rates, so they're cheaper to repay. Also, general obligation debt proceeds can be used for a variety of different purposes. And so you're not really pigeonholed into using them for one specific purpose. There are a variety of purposes that you can use that money for. The downside of general obligation bonds is that general obligation bonds are oftentimes subject to state limitations. So the state will come in and tell a local government, here is your general obligation debt capacity. Here's the amount of general obligation debt that you can issue, the total amount of general obligation debt that you can borrow on. If you are bumping against your debt capacity, then you're probably not going to be able to issue a general obligation bond. You're going to have to opt for another type of bond to issue. Another disadvantage of general obligation bonds is they usually require voter approval. And that voter approval is oftentimes a supermajority, 2/3 voter approval to issue that general obligation bond. Now, there are some exceptions to that. If you're a local school district, you can issue what's called a Prop 39 bond, and then the voter approval threshold is 55%. Still a supermajority, but much lower than that 2/3. So sometimes it is difficult for you to issue general obligation bonds, but if you can issue it, it is usually the most versatile and also the cheapest type of debt that you can issue. If you cannot issue a general obligation bond, or you do not want to pledge your full faith and credit, another type of bond that you can issue is what's called a revenue bond. So if you are using the proceeds of this bond for the purpose of constructing an enterprise, constructing a facility that will generate revenue. So we're going to build a recreation center, and then we're going to charge people dues, fees, to use that recreation center. We're then going to capture those fees, and we're going to use those fees to repay the debt. That would be something that you could use a revenue bond for. However, where you have to be careful here is, number one, revenue bonds are more expensive because they're more speculative investments. Here, to get back to Barry's question of what happens if they don't repay, with a revenue bond, if the facility goes belly up and the facility goes out of existence, there's no revenue coming in from the facility, then technically, depending on how that bond is written, the city would not have to then repay the debt. The investors would be out of their investment. So it's a much riskier type of investment, which means those investors are going to require much more reward. It's going to be a much higher interest rate that the city is going to have to pay to then repay that debt. Also, revenue bonds can only be used if the facility is generating enough revenue to cover both debt repayment as well as the normal operating expenditures for that facility. So it must generate a healthy enough amount of revenue to both repay the debt as well as to pay to keep the facility going. If there's not enough money to keep the facility going, then obviously you'll end up defaulting on that debt when that facility goes out of business. But the nice thing about revenue bonds is they are not subject to the same limitations that general obligation bonds are from the state. So there's not that same general obligation debt capacity that you have to worry about. However, revenue bonds are not always tax exempt. One of the biggest draws of government debt is that typically the interest that is earned on that debt is tax exempt. So the investors, the interest they earn will be exempt from federal income taxation. That is true for what we call public activity, public purpose debt, like general obligation bonds. Not all revenue bonds are considered to be public purpose, and we won't get into the definition of it, but essentially if a certain percentage of the bond proceeds are going toward benefiting a private corporation, a private business, then that may be considered private activity debt. And if it's considered private activity debt, then the interest is not exempt from federal income taxation, which makes it much less appealing to investors. So there are trade-offs for all these different types of bonds. A third type of bond we'll mention, and we'll stop our discussion of bonds here, is a double barrel bond. A double barrel bond is a combination of a general obligation and a revenue bond. So part of the issue will be general obligation, full faith and credit at a low interest rate. Part of the issue will be revenue bond, money being secured, repayment secured from the revenue generated by the facility, a higher interest rate. Since you are combining the two together, the interest rates for a double barrel bond will fall somewhere between a general obligation interest rate and a revenue bond interest rate. So it's kind of a good middle of the road approach if you want to limit your exposure with a general obligation bond, but you also don't generate enough revenue from the facility to do a complete revenue bond. You kind of combine the best of both worlds. You can do a 50-50 split, an 80-20 split, a 70-30 split, but that's what's considered to be a double barrel bond. There are a lot of other bonds that we don't have the time to get into in this class that you will probably get into in your 555 course. Things like capital appreciation bonds and zero coupon bonds and lease rental bonds and sale leaseback bonds and all kinds of different permutations of bonds that local governments have created to kind of give them a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they borrow money. But bonds are for long-term debt, and long-term debt in municipal finance is usually defined as debt that matures in more than 1 year. Typically, these bonds will have maturities of 20, 30, 40 years. The typical maturity is usually about 30 years. However, governments also borrow money in the short term, and short-term borrowing is referred to as notes. So long-term borrowing is known as bonds. Short-term borrowing is referred to as notes. Short-term borrowing will be money that is borrowed that matures in less than 1 year. So to give you a real quick example, because I know we're kind of running long in the tooth tonight, one example could be if you have a city that is getting to the end of its fiscal year, and it looks like it's going to end up in a deficit that doesn't have enough revenues to cover its expenditures. It will do some short-term borrowing, and it will probably issue something called a revenue anticipation note, which is a RAN. So it'll look at the next fiscal year and say, we have revenue that is scheduled to come into the government at the end of July. It's going to be in the next fiscal year. But what we will do is we will borrow money secured by that revenue that's coming in next fiscal year so that we can offset this imbalance between revenues and expenditures, avoid the appearance of a deficit, and avoid running afoul of the state constitution. So that's one reason why they may issue short-term debt, issue these notes to avoid the appearance of a deficit. Sometimes they will issue what are called bans. A ban is a bond anticipation note. So if you're going to issue a bond to construct this new aquatic center, it may take you 6, 8, 10 weeks before those bond proceeds are going to come in. You want to get started on the project right away, because the sooner you get started on the project, the more you can limit cost escalation. The longer you wait, the more expensive the project is going to become. So you want to get started right away. You issue a bond anticipation note. That note is then secured. The repayment of that note is secured with the proceeds of the bond when the proceeds of those bonds come in 6, 8, 10, or 12 weeks. So short-term debt, notes, long-term debt are referred to as bonds. And so not all debt is bad. If you're borrowing that money for a good purpose, such as a needed improvement to your physical plant, that's considered to be a good use of debt. However, if you're borrowing money to cover a deficit year after year, that would arguably be considered to be a bad use of debt. And then to kind of wrap up this discussion of public budgeting and finance, one thing we have learned about the federal budget process is that the federal budget process is out of control. We do not get the federal budget done on time. We have had multiple government shutdowns. We usually end up creating the budget in these omnibus budget reconciliation acts and way overspending what we should be spending. We run deficits year after year. So the budget process is certainly out of control. That idea that the budget process is out of control has not been lost on Congress. And so Congress, over the past several decades, has tried to get control over the federal budget process and has usually failed to do so. So a few really quick examples of how Congress has tried to reform the budgeting process to get it under control. In the 1970s, we had this very big piece of legislation called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. This is something, even though it was passed in the 1970s, that we are talking about prominently today. So we know there's been a lot of media coverage of the president refusing to spend money that's been appropriated by Congress. And so Congress appropriates the money. The president has decided, I'm not going to spend that money because I want that agency to go out of business and I want to get rid of that agency. When the president decides not to spend money that's been legally appropriated by Congress, that's what's known as a rescission. So the president is rescinding those funds and refusing to spend those funds. The Budget Impoundment Control Act, part of it was designed to try and limit the ability of the president to rescind funds. This is what is being argued about in the courts today. Does the president, as chief executive, have the ability to rescind these funds that have been legally appropriated through legislation by Congress? Under the Budget Impoundment Control Act, that said the president does not have the ability to do that. The president has the ability to defer spending for a temporary period of time, but not to completely rescind that spending. President Trump has done that or has threatened to do that. And so as that goes through the courts, we'll see what the Supreme Court says about the constitutionality of the Budget Impoundment Control Act. But also in the Budget Impoundment Control Act, Congress did a lot of things to try and reform the process itself. It changed the fiscal year to run from October 1st to September 30th. It created the House and Senate budget committees. It created this idea of that resolution process to try and impose some fiscal discipline on how much money Congress was spending. So it did all these things to change the process, and all those reforms of the process are still with us today. We still have House and Senate budget committees. We have a concurrent resolution on the budget. We have a fiscal year running from October 1st to September 30th. We have a congressional budget office. So we have all these things that are still with us today, but yet the process is still out of control. So I think you make the argument that the Budget Impoundment Control Act was a failure to get the budget under control. So Congress then doesn't give up easily, so it tries it again. In the 1980s, we end up with this piece of legislation called Graham-Rudman-Hollings, named after the three gentlemen on the screen. Phil Gramm, conservative Republican from Texas, Warren Rudman, an independent from New Hampshire, and Ernest Fritz Hollings, a Democrat from South Carolina. And yes, at that time, we actually had Democrats in the Senate from South Carolina. These three gentlemen got together in this bipartisan piece of legislation called Graham-Rudman-Hollings. The purpose of Graham-Rudman-Hollings was to try and get rid of deficits. By 1985, we had run deficits since 1969. So we had 16 consecutive years of deficits, and every year those deficits got bigger and bigger. So under Graham-Rudman-Hollings, what the legislation did is it set up a timetable for the reduction of deficits. So every year we'd have a maximum allowable deficit. Then the next year, that maximum deficit target would go down and then go down and go down until eventually at the end of the timetable, the maximum allowable deficit would be zero and we will have eliminated deficits. Problem with that is that if Congress establishes those targets, Congress can then change those targets. So Congress ignored the targets, they changed them, they increased the targets, and instead of the deficit going down, the deficit continued to increase. So that attempt was a failure. Then in the 1990s, we got a piece of legislation that actually had somewhat of a positive effect. And that was what was known as the Budget Enforcement Act. The Budget Enforcement Act said, instead of focusing squarely on deficits, let's focus on spending. And if we can limit the amount of spending, that will allow us to then indirectly avoid deficits. So what they did is they created three different categories of spending under the Budget Enforcement Act. They created a category of defense spending, a category of domestic spending, and a category of international spending. Then they placed what they call firewalls between each one of these categories, meaning that you could not steal from one category to pay for an increase in spending in another category. So these firewalls just walled off defense from domestic, from international spending. Then it also created this acronym known as PAYGO. PAYGO stood for Pay As You Go. Said if you want to increase spending on a program, you have to pay for it either with a tax increase to bring in new revenue, or you have to pay for it by reducing spending on another program within that same general spending area. So anytime you want to increase spending, you have to pay for those increases. Again, a way to limit spending to get us away from running deficits. The follow-up to the Budget Enforcement Act in 1993 and 1997 were the Balanced Budget Acts. That combined with a very quickly growing economy in the 1990s due to the growth of the internet and the dot-com boom in the Silicon Valley, we had a lot more revenue coming into federal coffers. And it's not rocket science to figure out that if you have more revenue coming in and you're spending less money, you're going to at least eventually be able to eliminate deficits. We were able to eliminate deficits in fiscal year 99 and 2000. So those were the 2 years that we got rid of deficits and we were actually in surplus spending. Then the events of September 11th happened in 2001. We had the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war against terror, this explosion in terms of the amount of money that we are spending. Our expenditures went up through the roof, and we ended up right back in deficit spending. And we have been in deficit spending every year since 2001. So what? My favorite question is always, so what? The so what is, it really doesn't matter how many procedural changes we put in place. If we do not have the political willpower to make the difficult decisions, to get budgets done on time, and to reduce our spending, or in turn also increase revenue, if we don't have the political willpower to make those difficult decisions, we are never going to get the federal budget process under control. I think you can make a very compelling argument that the federal budget process is more out of control today than it ever was in the past. Comparing it to the state of California, I think you can make the argument that here in California, the budget process is in better control, in that we usually do a better job of avoiding deficits. Now, not every year, and we've seen that recently, but we do a better job avoiding deficits, and we certainly do get the budget done on time. But again, some of the artifacts of having one-party government really explain why we oftentimes get the budget done on time here in California, as opposed to a very partisan split in the House and the Senate up on Capitol Hill. So that should then provide you with all the information that you need in order to deal with the scenario on the final assessment, dealing with this issue of public budgeting and finance. Now, I know we covered a whole lot of information and we did it tonight in a very short period of time, but I wanted to make sure we got through all the information so you had a full week to work on the final assessment with all the information you need to do a good job on the assessment. That being said, do you have any quick questions about any of this information, any clarifications needed on any of the information we covered tonight on management of human resources or management of financial resources? 577 and 555. If not, then in our couple of minutes that we have remaining tonight, just a quick reminder, your final assessment is due next Tuesday by midnight. Same ground rules apply to the final assessment that applied to the midterm assessment. 1 to 2 paragraph answers, certainly good enough. You do not have to go out there and do outside research. It is an assessment of your understanding and ability to apply the information that you have learned in this course. We will not have a meeting next Tuesday. This is our final Tuesday evening Zoom session because I want to give you next Tuesday to work on the final assessment. The university usually requires that even in hybrid courses, that the final class session is reserved for some type of final culminating assignment. And so to be in accordance with the university policy, that's what we are going to do. So next Tuesday, there's not a Zoom session. You'll just be finishing up your final assessment. Feel free to turn that final assessment in early. If you get it done early, I will be watching the Dropbox between now and next Tuesday. I will be grading them as they come in, and I'll grade them in the same way in which I grade the midterm assessments, providing you with my comments in the annotation feature, and then also providing you some general comments in the feedback box and a numerical score out of 100. I know we covered a lot of information. We covered it very, very quickly, but the nice thing about these hybrid courses, it allows you to get this course done. And then if there is a second half hybrid course that you are interested in, to do that second half hybrid course without overlapping onto this course. And that's the whole purpose of these hybrid courses. I hope this is to provide the information that you need to give a good introduction, not just to the MPA program, but also an introduction to the field and discipline of public administration and an introduction to your future core courses that you'll be taking the program, so that when you get to those core courses, a lot of these types of topics and concepts will not be unusual. They will not be novel and new. There'll be things that you can say, I remember we covered that in 500, and it'll give you a little bit of a head start into those core courses. Okay. As you work on the final assessment, any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me via email. I will be available via email all the way through next Tuesday at midnight. And so feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And in our last 30 seconds, thank you very much for your hard work this semester. It's been a pleasure working with everyone. And I will get this recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good luck in the program, and I look forward to having you in class again in the very near future. So take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Take care.
I have one question.
Thank you, President.
Sure, go ahead.